The Russian invasion of Ukraine has everyone watching Europe right now, and it has some people a little bit on edge. Joining me to discuss this and provide some analysis is Dr. David Marples, who is a university professor of Russian and Eastern European history at the Department of History and Classics at the University of Alberta. Dr. Marples joins me now. Thanks so much for coming on the show today, David. Appreciate having you.
You're very welcome. Nice to chat.
Can you maybe tell us if this military action by Russia is anything new, or is it a continuation of a historic conflict? How far back does the conflict between Russia and Ukraine go?
Well, I think it's something quite new because it's nothing like the scale of this has happened before. If you want to go back to previous centuries, I think you're talking about a time when the nation state didn't really exist. And in the 20th century, maybe the time when the Bolsheviks took power and the Russian Civil War was taking place in Ukraine, and ultimately a Soviet Ukraine was founded by the Bolsheviks in the city of Kharkiv. I can't really think back to anything else other than maybe in the Second World War. But at that time, most of the Ukrainian soldiers were fighting in the Red Army. But in the western part of Ukraine, there were guerrillas resisting Soviet rule in the period from about 1944 to 50. But there's no precedent for what's happening today. This is a full-scale invasion of one state by another. And supposedly they are fraternal people, right? This is Putin's claim that Ukrainians and Russians are from the same stock. And if that's true, it makes even less sense that you would see an attack like this taking place.
Mm-hmm. So there is some political rhetoric going around that this military action between Russia and Ukraine is an attempt by Vladimir Putin to destabilize the powers in Europe. What do you say about this suggestion?
Well, Putin has always looked for opportunities to divide EU members, for example. And he's formed close relationships with the Hungarian president, Mr. Orban. He's also been on pretty good terms with Germany for most of his time in office, and especially as a trading economic partner. But he's not really tried to undermine Europe per se. I think his focus is particularly on Ukraine and the fact that Ukraine is moving out of the Russian orbit and would prefer to be associated with European structures, and more recently, a member of the NATO alliance. I mean, that's a legitimate question. I think if you're dealing with a Central European state of 44 million people, but at the same time, it's a democratic state which has determined its own direction. And that direction is not the same direction that Russia has been pursuing since Putin took power, which has been to reverse a lot of the things that happened back in the early 1990s, and for Russia to restore its position as a regional power and then ultimately as a global power by not necessarily reintegrating the Soviet Union, but certainly forming close ties with the states like Belarus and Ukraine that it considers to be part of its own sphere of interest. But in every case, I would say that all the institutions that Russia's developed since 1991 have been Russian-controlled. Things like the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Russia-Belarus Union, all these are under close Russian control. And Ukraine is not part of any of them, and has shown no desire to be part of them.
Right. It's interesting that you bring up Belarus, because we're hearing that Russian troops have passed through Belarus to enter Ukraine. So what is the historic connection there between Russia and Belarus versus Ukraine?
Well, all three states in the Soviet period were regarded as the East Slavic states that are the founders of modern-day Russia. The Ukrainian argument would be exactly the opposite, that the Kievan state, which accepted Christianity back in the 10th century, was an exclusively Ukrainian state and is the forerunner of today's Ukraine. Russia, including Vladimir Putin, is claiming that Russia, Belarus, Ukraine are all the same people. They're all from that same root in Kiev back in the 10th century. And therefore, there should be no difference between them. And Belarus, under Alexander Lukashenko, who's been in power since 1994, have been traditionally much closer to Russia. Most of the country is Russian speaking. But in 2020, in the election there, Lukashenko was challenged by a popular candidate, female candidate, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who, according to all accounts, won that election. And yet Lukashenko announced that he'd won with 80% of the vote. And that was followed by mass demonstrations that went on for months in Belarus. So Belarus did unravel considerably, but Lukashenko had managed to stay in power by using security forces and the threat of Russian intervention, and Russia taking over much of the foreign policy of Belarus. So the two are now in line, but you could also say that the population of Belarus is traditionally been friendly with Ukraine. And I would say they've probably got quite a lot in common even today. Most of Belarus does not like its president and resent what Putin is doing in Ukraine as well.
Interesting. Now, how far do you think this conflict will go? Will other countries get involved? I've heard some even say that we could be on the brink of World War III. Is it that serious?
Well, I was listening to President Biden, and he said on no account would NATO forces enter this conflict, that they would do all they can to aid Ukraine with defensive weapons, but there would not be any intrusion of NATO forces into the battlefield. And I think that's probably what will happen. I cannot imagine that there would be intervention. It is possible, I suppose, that the war could spill over the border, perhaps into Poland. But I kind of doubt that would happen, because I think Russians are being careful, at least so far, to hit military targets and to focus on major Ukrainian cities, particularly Kiev and Kharkiv. So I think it's unlikely that it would develop into a third world war. And yet, Biden has been quite strong. He's taken quite a strong line. And as far as sanctions go, he probably couldn't do a lot more than he has done. But at the same time, it seems pathetically inadequate given what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. And I think many Ukrainians feel the same way.
Yeah. And what about for us here in North America? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for the rest of the world right now? How is it going to affect us? Will it affect oil and gas prices, the stock market, for example?
Yeah, and in different ways. I mean, the oil prices have already begun to skyrocket, whereas the stock market has begun to fall. And in Russia, it's had a catastrophic fall, as has the Russian ruble against the US dollar, is now at its lowest level ever since the ruble became exchangeable. So those things are already happening. But I think on a more serious note, China has stood by Russia on this one, and China's got its own territorial demands on Taiwan, and Hong Kong, I would say, would also fall into that same category. And the logic is, if this succeeds, there may be a tendency for powerful states to take it into their own hands to carve out bits of neighbors' territory, which hasn't really happened since the Second World War. We've not had any major border changes in Europe since the Second World War. The state of Kosovo was formed in 2008, but that was an exception. And all the border changes that have taken place have been due to Russian interventions in Moldova, in Georgia, and in Ukraine. So I think this is a bigger step by Russia. They're not just trying to annex or grant independence to the eastern territories of the Donbass that have declared independence. They are trying to occupy key regions of Ukraine, and I suspect quite strongly that the goal is to replace the Ukrainian government in Kiev with something a little bit more amenable to Russia, put some pro-Russian opposition figures in power there, so that these leaders can then make a firm commitment that Ukraine will be part of the Russian sphere, that it will never join NATO, and probably that it will never join the European Union either. So I think that's basically why there's a broader danger today of what could happen if everyone just sits back and accepts this and watches while Ukraine is sort of brought to a standstill and its government replaced. And I think there's plenty of hope long term that this could happen, because I think it's almost impossible for Russia to control Ukraine indefinitely if the population is totally opposed to Russian rule. And there are precedents. I mean, they tried very hard in Afghanistan for nearly 10 years to have a pro-Soviet government or pro-Russian government there, and completely failed. And here, I think the same again. Ukrainians are looking westward, and they have a different attitude to Russian mainstream, actually. They travel more widely than Russians. They see their future as in Europe. And although there's a lot of corruption in Ukraine, there's a lot of economic problems as well. Basically, Ukraine is much more democratic state than Russia is today. And I think they would like to continue that if they get the chance.
You'd mentioned sanctions against Russia. Do you think that those sanctions will have any effect on Russia and its choices?
I don't think they'll have much other than the postponement of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia to Germany. That is a source of future income for Russia, and there would be quite a substantial sum that's being lost while that is not operating. It's finished, in theory, it could start right away. But the Germans, to their great credit, I think, have postponed it indefinitely, given what's happened in Ukraine. I think otherwise, as long as China continues to back Russia and would take its oil and gas if the Europeans stop importing it, then sanctions cannot have a big effect, because most of Russia's trade is with China and Europe, of course, but China is a huge partner. And China could have a big say in this as well. It's also the United States' largest trade partner as well, for that matter. So that's why I think it's more of an international problem, as long as China and Russia are following in the same direction, which is somewhat unusual historically, actually. But they both got leaders who are autocratic, dictatorial, and have shown a tendency to try to push people around and get their own way.
Do you think that China is going to get involved militarily in this? I heard reports that I believe Taiwan observed missiles or something from China earlier. Did you hear anything about that?
I did, and I think there is a possibility that if Russia succeeds without getting any major repercussions, then the Chinese would definitely be encouraged to do the same with Taiwan, which has been I don't know what you call it really, a problem for them for the past, since 1949?
A long time,
So
yeah,
you could
decades
say
for
more than
sure.
70 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and they would like to get rid of that problem, the nationalist government of China. At one time, Taiwan was quite powerful and was actually in a position to threaten China considerably, but now it isn't. Economically, it's powerful, but in terms of military power, it cannot really compete with China. So that could happen. I was going to say, I don't think China is interested in getting militarily involved in Russia. I mean, the Chinese would like the whole thing to be over as soon as possible so it can continue to trade with both countries. That would be the ideal situation for the Chinese. But at the same time, they would like to see Russia succeed, just as an example of a powerful state getting its own way without running into objections through the UN. And on that note, I think the UN is also a huge problem, because the UN Security Council cannot do anything as long as China and Russia have the veto power to stop it. And I don't know whether there ought to be some review of that Security Council and its permanent membership. Perhaps even, for example, a rotating membership now. After all this time, after 1945, they've had these same 5 members with veto power, which actually includes Britain and France, which are not really great powers anymore. But Russia and China are part of it at the moment, and they will always be part of it. So the UN can do nothing as long as there's this veto power in its way. It doesn't really leave any major organization to intervene as a mediator, other than perhaps the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, of which Canada is actually a member. But that's not very powerful. It doesn't have any kind of military clout. And they've been in the Donbass for the past 8 years, and they've had a lot of problems there. And I doubt they could deal with the situation on this kind of scale.
I'm about out of time, but I have one last really quick question. Do you think that Russia would have anything to lose by staying out of Ukraine?
As Russian territory dating back to the 19th century or earlier, he doesn't regard Western Ukraine as part of this same structure. That is the area around Lviv, Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, all these places that were only occupied after the Second World War by the Soviet Union. There is, therefore, part of Ukraine that appears different to Putin to the rest of Ukraine. I mean, I think Ukraine is an entity, should be accepted in its 1991 borders. But I think there is that possibility of a Western part of Ukraine organizing the Ukrainian exile government, if you like, or a government of its own, if the one in Kiev falls. I mean, that's a terrible thing to foresee or to anticipate, and I hope that never happens. But there certainly has to be something keeping Ukrainian statehood alive if the capital is occupied for the short or long term by Russian forces. So that's all I could answer on that one.
Oh, no, that's more than enough. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate your expertise and just coming on and giving us a bit of a broader view of all of that. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Dr. David Marples is a university professor of Russian and East European history at the University of Alberta. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for joining.